I can turn to you, Archbishop. Your diocese, the Archdiocese of Brisbane, is one of the authorising church bodies for the council, that's right?
That's right.
In addition, I think you're a member of the supervisory group.
I am, and a member of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council as well, and the National Committee for Professional Standards.
With the supervisory group, what role does that play with the council?
It was simply to supervise the work of the council and to advise the council on what might be the best way forward. So it was to keep in touch with the work of the council, the bishops and the major superiors, so to facilitate a kind of exchange between the council and the bodies which established it.
The supervisory group has clergy and religious?
Indeed, it has what's called the Permanent Committee of the Bishops' Conference, which is a group of about 6 or 7 bishops, most of them fairly senior, and then a smaller group of religious superiors. And
the council itself has lay people as well as clergy?
It is predominantly lay, and there are 2 bishops who sit on the council, myself and Bishop Wright.
Thank you. Now, as Mr Owen's given evidence, the prime purpose of the company is to set standards. In the council submission, there's a reference to the sorts of areas in which standards might be set. I wanted to ask you, Archbishop, what you consider to be the areas in which standards should be set.
In the end, it would be any area that the board decided, but some of the areas are quite obvious. One is the handling of complaints. In other words, dealing with abuse that has happened, but also proposing standards that embody preventative measures. So that would be a crucial part of the setting of standards. And then a third part would have to do with the process of education, which would look, as would the other 2 areas, to shifting the culture.
Education of whom?
Education across the board, but particularly those who have responsibility, including bishops and major superiors, but anyone who is involved with young people, clergy certainly, education understood therefore in the broader sense and in an ongoing way.
What about seminary training?
Absolutely.
Selection of positions such as parish priest?
Yes, that would certainly have to come into it. Selection of people across the board, but clearly the clergy are in a very strategic position. So there would have to be a standard, I think, that would touch upon the selection of people to be parish priests or to hold any position of clerical responsibility in the church.
What about standards in relation to taking disciplinary action against priests or dismissal, or leaving aside canon law?
That could certainly happen, and it may in fact help in a process that can be difficult and very complex. So that as a bishop, I would welcome any guidance that CPS might be able to offer that was consonant, obviously, with canon law. So again, CPS with its standards wouldn't supplant canon law, but would work harmoniously with it. But if there were standards proposed that could help in that process, I for one, and I think many of the bishops and others would welcome them.
Given the role of members on the board, I take it that you consider that you would be able to speak frankly to the directors as to the areas in which you think you and your fellow bishops would benefit advice?
There would certainly be that open exchange, but I would be very hesitant of, certainly in these early stages, of giving any impression of wanting to lay down the law or tell the directors what to do. I think they need to be helped in a process of induction, But the last thing they would need, I think, is to have bishops or others breathing down their neck or telling them what to do. So I have spoken already with the three directors that we have, but in a way that is deeply respectful of their independence, because given what Mr. Owen has said about functional independence rather than structural, I think people like me as a member, representative, I need to be very sensitive to the need to respect that functional independence.
Who are the three board members?
Justice Jeffrey Giudice, Mr. John Watkins, and Ms. Patricia Faulkner.
Thank you. And they were appointed, obviously, recently, given that the committee, the company was established, I think, in November.
They were appointed subsequent to the launch of the company in November, so at the very end of last year.
They're paid, presumably, for their work?
There has been some discussion about remuneration, and it's only been resolved in quite recent times, but yes, they are remunerated appropriately.
Are they part-time or full-time?
They are part-time.
Sorry, the transcription people have missed the name of the judge.
Judge Jeffrey Giudice, Federal Court judge, retired, was also chair, I think, of the Fair Work Commission.
He was the former head of the body that preceded the Fair Work Commission.
The GUIDECE?
Yeah, GIUDICE, Italian for judge.
Now, there's been a deal of evidence over the last couple of weeks about the interaction with canon law, particularly in relation to disciplinary matters and the role of the CDF. Is that an area where you think that you and fellow bishops and religious would benefit from standards?
It could well be. What is certain, and I think this has emerged in earlier sessions, is that a neglect of canon law in many ways has been one of our problems, not an excessive dependence upon it, but rather a neglect of it. And I was very interested listening to Ms. Devlin speak the other day where she spoke about how helpful canon law can be if it's appropriately interpreted and applied. So if, again, there could be a standard that helped the bishops to draw upon the considerable resources of the canons, again, I certainly would welcome it, and I think others would too.
The need for diversity in the church, is that a standard that you'd like to see available?
That could be a little too broad. By diversity, do you mean the involvement of lay people and perhaps women at the point of governance? Or it's not clear to me immediately what you mean by diversity.
Do you have your own understanding of what diversity means in the context of the church?
I have my own understanding and experience. The Catholic Church is extraordinarily diverse.
So what are the components that make up the diversity you've identified?
Ethnic diversity, the diversity that exists between the church in urban settings and rural settings, the church of the young and the not so young. Someone once said that the motto of the Catholic Church should be, "Here comes everybody." So diversity is, I think, one of the hallmarks of a church that calls itself Catholic, universal. But if you look at the concept of diversity in a narrower sense, so who governs in the church, then of course you have to speak in different terms about diversity.
So diversity in terms of governance, is that something a standard could be devised that would assist you and your colleagues?
I could certainly see that, as long as it wasn't motherhood and apple pie, if I could put it in those terms, stated in such a broad and obvious way as to be less than really helpful. But if there were specific standards devised to foster the process already taking place of broadening the base of decision-making in the church, then again, that would seem to me to be a very creative thing.
What about a standard on transparency in terms of decision-making and the preparation of written reasons and record-keeping?
Yes, I think, again, that could be very helpful. record keeping has been at times one of our problems, certainly. And anything that would generate a greater transparency of a kind appropriate to the church, I think would be, again, a very positive move.
Thank you. Now, Archbishop, is there anything you wanted to add to what Mr Owen said this morning?
Perhaps I should just touch upon the relationship between bishop and priest. Mr Owen touched upon it, but deferred to others, and I may be one of those others, that I don't think it's realistic to think of a priest in a diocese entering into a contract with this new company. But I do think it's worth bishops considering some kind of formal agreement with people like clergy, but I wouldn't exclude others either, entering into some kind of formal agreement with them that they will be part of this general compliance, because although the duty to comply applies primarily to the church authority, to the bishop in this case, it has to include the whole community. It can't be just the church authority. Now, if a priest fails to abide by the duty to comply, I then, as the bishop, do have a duty, even though in the strict sense he is not my employee. But were this to be a pattern of non-compliance, I would be obliged to act. What would acting mean? It would mean, in the first place, I would sit down and speak very directly to the priest and seek an explanation from him. If there was still a failure to comply, I would have to consider other options, such as standing him aside from his parish appointment or even removing his faculties. So there are sanctions available. These are serious sanctions, to stand a man aside or to remove his faculties. But given the seriousness of what we're discussing, they are measures that I would consider. And it's not unthinkable that such measures could be touched upon by new standards that were proposed.
Canon law, I take it, wouldn't preclude you standing a man down or removing his faculties for the reason of non-compliance with a standard which was the subject of a contract to which he was party?
Well, again, I wouldn't speak of it as a contract. I would enter into the contract with CPS. But if he was and consistently in breach of something that might be a formal agreement with me as the bishop, then I would have to act.
And canon law wouldn't preclude you from doing that?
It wouldn't.
Thank you. Can I turn to you?
Before you do, Archbishop, you heard the discussion before the adjournment about clause 5.3 of the Constitution. I raised the provisions of that clause with Mr Owen. It's the one which provides the discretion not to publish. Do you understand why there will be people who will react adversely to such a broad discretion?
Yes, I can. And for me, it's important to note that it's the board that makes the decision. It wouldn't be the member representatives. But nonetheless, I think as it's phrased, it has the potential for a range of interpretations, some of which could certainly give that impression that it's an attempt to resist the publication of the information. And without that publication, this whole proposal lacks teeth.
It just falls to the ground, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Might I also say, Your Honour, that in general terms, and I think Mr Owen touched upon this, there are elements of the drafting of this Constitution which even now, in the light of this final hearing and the discussions that it's prompted, the elements of the drafting which will have to be revisited. But that can be done. I personally think that's one of them, and Mr Owen has already touched upon the reserve powers.
Yeah.
Mr Nett, would you mind if I re-enter the phrase?
Certainly, certainly.
Yeah, Your Honour, I've been reflecting on what you said, and there's one other thing that I would like to throw into the mix in thinking about this. not going back on anything I said about the breadth of that provision. And it's this: you can't read it without reference to the object, the main object of this company. And you can't read it, because it's a power of the board, you can't read it absent the fiduciary duty of a director to act in the best interests of the company and only for proper purposes, which certainly in 2008, that was the law that they were fiduciary duties. But if you go back to the preamble, which is on the first full page, and the last sentence of the preamble refers to the national professional standards seeking to promote accountability and transparency, and therefore trust in the life of the church. The directors, in exercising power not to publish in 5.3, would have to be acutely aware of their fiduciary duty that involves, in part, those words in the object. I just add that as another.
There might be some who would say, Mr. Owen, there's a real conflict there. See, to not publish because it might mislead the public, how could that ever be a legitimate reason to publish something that's otherwise accurate?
All I'm saying, Your Honour, is that you couldn't divorce that from the fiduciary nature of the duty which the directors would have to act in the best interest of the company. I just add that as a further consideration.
Well, yeah.
Before you move on, Ms. Finesse, Archbishop, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's not exclusive to the Catholic Church. It's an issue for all faith-based organisations and secular organisations, and that's the issue of managing risk. Principle 7 of the Corporate Governance Principles says that organisations should recognise and manage risk. And if we look at what has been before the Royal Commission and been before your Catholic Church, tremendous financial and reputational damage and damage to patronage has resulted from the Church's bad handling of child sexual abuse issues, both their occurrence and their reporting and their continuance. Is there anything in this organisation, this new organisation, Professional Standards Organisation, which will focus on really educating bishops and priests, the managers of Catholic business, on risk and to avoid that risk and its terrible consequences in future?
Given that education is one of the prime purposes of this new entity, I would certainly expect that would be an essential element of its work, to continue and develop further the process of education which leads to a far greater and more sophisticated understanding of risk management and what it involves. And so I would see that as essential to the work of Catholic Professional Standards Limited.
I have asked you that question deliberately because I have picked up an inference, and it's certainly not yours, but I've picked up an inference amongst some commentators that this child abuse issue is historical and there's not as much need to worry about it in the future. I personally disagree with that, and I stress I don't see it as your view, but that does mean the constant emphasis of risk and the avoidance of any sense of a cover-up has to be absolutely critical to the operation of this company. Would you agree?
I agree totally with that, and I am deeply suspicious, and that's putting it mildly, of scenarios that talk about this as merely something of the past. An apocalyptic sense that it was all bad back then and everything's right now. What is abundantly clear to me, Commissioner, is that there is no room whatsoever for complacency, given the nature of what we are dealing with. A lot of the stuff we are dealing with is historic, but that says very little in one angle on things. So that any sense of complacency, that there is no need for a great vigilance and to work harder and harder and harder at developing a culture of vigilance that makes for real safeguarding, I think has to be rejected. And I see this move, in fact, as one way to guard against that kind of complacency that I do hear voiced myself from time to time, but I reject it out of hand.
If I can move to you, Mr. Sullivan, just firstly dealing with redress, you have made some public comments in relation to embracing the Commonwealth Government's response to the Royal Commission's recommendation. Are you able, on behalf of your authorising church bodies, to opt into the scheme?
No.
So any opting in by the council is mere commentary on what you'd like to see happen?
It's certainly, the comments we made is consistent with the church leadership's support for a national redress scheme. And when the announcement was made by the Prime Minister, in the Broad, that was the type of scheme that our church leadership supports. And that's why we said, in the Broad, we can opt in. But I gather there will be, I think, constitutional issues between the Commonwealth and the states over how opting in will occur for any non-government organisation into a scheme that's run by the Commonwealth.
So is it the case, as you understand it, just dealing with the Catholic Church, that each bishop and provincial or major religious superior has to opt in for their particular area of work?
Practically speaking, yes.
And as you understand it, there may be an issue if the state, for whatever reason, doesn't opt in, that the Catholic authority within that state may have difficulties opting in.
It's my understanding that is the current advice on the table at the Commonwealth level, but I haven't seen it, neither has anybody else.
Nor have we. So this is what you're being told by someone?
In the months leading up to, straight after the announcement, there's been a couple of months of informal consultation by the task force from Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Do we know who's given this advice?
I can only assume it's one of the Commonwealth agencies that give advice around constitutional matters.
Do you know what is said? Is it said that a non-government body can't contract with the Commonwealth, if that's what's being said?
I haven't read it because I haven't seen it in writing, but at two meetings that I've been at, it was expressed by the Commonwealth officers from Prime Minister and Cabinet that they had advice to that effect, that organisations that would like to opt into the proposed Commonwealth scheme would only be able to do so if their state government had agreed to, now don't hold me to the technical terms, but in effect opt in. It may not mean that the state government itself would participate, but it enabled those organisations within that state or jurisdiction to participate. I don't understand the fine detail.
It would be remarkable if a state stood in the way.
Well, I hope no state will stand in the way because of the real reason why we need a national scheme.
As part of the work that's been done in recent time by the council and presumably the leadership of the church, a Catholic ministry register has been created. And the purpose of that register is to what?
Well, as I understand it, the work has been done by the National Committee for Professional Standards. They initiated the work such that priests in a particular diocese, through their bishop and religious leader, will be put on a register, and that register will obviously be clear about credentials, qualifications, where they've come from, how long they've served, that type of thing. So it's part of this whole process of being more transparent about where priests have come from, if they've transferred from a particular diocese or country, that type of thing.
What about complaints?
I'm not aware if it covers that. It may not.
Discipline?
Same, I don't know for sure.
There's reference to good standing and a finding of good standing in relation to individual priests or religious.
Yes.
Can you help us with whether that includes any complaints substantiated or otherwise, or disciplinary action that's been taken against them being included?
With my understanding it does, but maybe Archbishop Coleridge may know more.
Archbishop?
If I may, Ms. Furness, if there have been allegations against a priest, and certainly if they're substantiated, he would not be, he doesn't qualify for registration on this Australian Catholic Ministry Register, the purpose of which was to create a consistent national registry, which is much harder than it sounds. Now, if a priest doesn't appear on the ACMR, then the understanding is that the church authority that is inquiring about the priest would contact the church authority who is responsible for the priest and would talk directly and perhaps seek documentation about those allegations. So it's not as if every priest is registered, not at all. And certainly where there have been allegations made and allegations substantiated or convictions incurred, then they would not appear on the ACMR.
And the bishop who was interested in a particular fellow, if he didn't find him on the ACMR, he could conclude it was an administrative error, or he could contact the person to whom he knows the priest has come from.
What he would do, and this is the understanding of this whole initiative, is he would then contact the bishop from the place where this priest is coming and would say, what is the reason for the non-registration of this priest who wants to come to my diocese, for instance, to celebrate a wedding? And the two bishops would then talk, and there may in fact be an exchange, and this has happened from time to time, of documentation that would give more detail of the allegations.
Wouldn't it be easier, Archbishop, to have all the priests on the register and perhaps a red flag against some of them?
That has been considered, but the decision was to move in this other direction.
Does it work, do you think?
Again, it's in its embryonic stage, and getting it up and running has been a far greater task and more complex than we imagined. So it's hard to know, but if it doesn't work, then we will simply have to revisit it.
Now, I take it it's a register that's available only to those within the church?
Technically, no. It would be available to anyone. Certainly the prime purpose of it was to notify other church authorities of the standing of this or that priest. But what it means is that each priest who is registered has a particular code number, and that's then fed in to the website, and you then access the data on that priest. Now, if someone had access to that code number, whether church personnel or not, he or she could access the data. But the understanding initially was it would be an intra-church initiative.
And it would be at the initiative of the priest to say, I want to be registered?
No, it was at the initiative of the church authorities. It was compulsory.
It still is?
It still is.
So a church authority who had a man ordained and working within his diocese would be required to enter details about that man onto the register?
That's my understanding.
Is there a requirement that that bishop pursue access to records perhaps before his time to understand what indeed was known about the priest?
That would certainly happen, And it's one of the reasons why in my own diocese we have done a rather exhaustive culling of the data from years past.
And that's by reference to hard copy data that's within the bishop's office. Is that right?
Right, the clergy files.
And to the extent that the clergy files don't contain any of that material, then that would be the end of it.
If there were gaps in the clergy file, and there are, then that would create a difficulty. But we can only work with what we have, or what has emerged perhaps as a result of this Royal Commission.
Given that there has been evidence of documents being not created, moved or destroyed in one way or another, that creates quite a significant problem for the credibility of the register, doesn't it?
I don't think it does for priests who are still living and working. It does if you're looking back upon the deceased priests, it would create problems. But we're registering those who are still living and still working, and there's far less of the gaps and silences in the files in more recent times than there were in the past. So we haven't struck that as a major problem in assembling this register.
Well, you wouldn't know, Archbishop, if the documents weren't there, you wouldn't know.
Again, I can only say we can only work with what we have. And so far, the lack of documentation hasn't been a major stumbling block.
I take it that the person has to agree to their name being placed on the register.
If any priest balked at it, again, the church authority would want to know why, because it is an obligatory thing for all clergy, so that if someone said, I don't want to be registered or refuse to be, then the question would be why, and we'd simply have to work our way through that. Because
the frequently asked questions indicates that the person will not have their name placed on the register without their cooperation.
But I can't imagine why someone who was in good standing would balk at having their name put on the register. Someone who was not in good standing might, but his name wouldn't be put on the register anyway.
And therefore you'd expect the priest, the bishop, that the priest is moving to ring up and ask the priest, the bishop that the priest was leaving, as to whether or not the man was in good standing and why his name wasn't on the register.
That's right.
Has that happened?
Yes, I've had, I think, 2 instances in Brisbane, and I presume it's happened elsewhere. I can't say that with certainty, but I presume that.
Is this an issue that the standards setters in the company could take up, advice on how to set up a registration system that, among other reasons, had the purpose of protecting children?
Again, I can only say, as one of the bishops, I would be very open to anything that came from CPS, from the board, a standard that would help us to operate a more effective ministry register.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Owen suggested that you might be a more appropriate person to ask questions about the statistics, which it is intended, understanding that you're not binding the company, intended will be published.
What particularly would you like?
Which statistics will be published?
Oh, I see. Well, a couple of things, if I may. As you know, we've cooperated with the Royal Commission's research project over a number of years now, and prior to that we tried to do it ourselves, not very successfully. And that's bringing together some type of national database of claims. And it really did take the rigour of the Royal Commission to produce that. It was always envisaged that something like this oversight company could be the place in which a national database could then reside. We never outlined what particular categories would comprise the database, but clearly, given the exercise we've just been through, it would be silly of us not to build on those categories of the current survey, would be my thinking. What's important, firstly, as you know from our own experience, is making sure that whatever we call claims, whatever we call alleged accused and so on, those categories are as accurate as they can be. And then how you would like to split the stats and do the analysis. But I would have thought the basic categories would be around claims, claimants, alleged abuse, outcome, monies paid, reporting lines, whether it was reported to the police or whatever. It's pretty similar to the type of criteria that were used in the current survey.
And you would intend that that be made public?
Of course.
On a presumably periodic basis, it would be updated?
Yes, given the way it took us this long to get this far, I wouldn't say annually, but hopefully as regularly as possible and certainly publicly.
The company we've been discussing is a product of the council's work? That's
Yes.
right. Are there any other recommendations or changes that have been initiated by the council in a similar way?
When we put in our first major submission to the Royal Commission, we did talk about a number of reforms, one of which was the idea of establishing an oversight body. And this is the product of that. If I could just say, you know, getting change in the Catholic Church is heroic. And it takes a lot of time sometimes to get small changes. This type of change, although it has its problems, is quite a significant change. The real driver for this change has been the historic poor performance of church leaders. You'll notice in some of the materials that bodies like the Irish body or, say, the US body or whatever already exist. And in Australia, we had the National Committee for Professional Standards, which for its time was a real innovation. And over time, it's sort of run out of puff. But the real problem is that the church leadership was never held to account. And that you've seen this in your own case studies. And that's why our council wanted to go down this pathway of trying to put something in place that can hold church leaders to account. Because in reality, a bishop is basically, in a technical sense, accountable to the Pope.
So is it the case that the accountability through this mechanism is via compulsory audits and publication of the results?
Correct. That's the best we can come up with at the moment. Can I also say, though, this momentum is also being done because although the Royal Commission has its own considerations and we don't wish in any way to seem to preempt it, at the same time I don't think we could go through 4 and a bit years of the Royal Commission continually saying that there's something wrong with the administration of Towards Healing and not begin something to do with that. Secondly, if the governments decide to turn around from some recommendation the Royal Commission makes and in effect it nearly makes our company superfluous, well, fine. I mean, we're not trying to set up something to ward off something else. If there's a way of doing this better, I'm sure the church leadership would seriously consider that because I don't want to overstress it, I suppose you can't. But the loss of credibility and trust in the Catholic Church, in the way it's managed this whole, for decades, scandal, in the way we are now even trying to put something together that is new and innovative, and the degree that people are looking at that sort of going, reflects the loss of credibility. And frankly, whatever it takes to regain that credibility will need to be done, including if there needs to be changes to the Constitution to tighten up the way people feel, it should better reflect the preamble, then so be it.
When you made a statement at the beginning of the hearing,
Yes.
Mr. Sullivan, you said that in relation to the church leadership, that, and I'll quote you, the fact that the church leadership chose to rely on the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, a lay-led advisory body, and that it has accepted all of its policy recommendations is a reflection of change. What policy recommendations have you put up that have been accepted by the church leadership?
Yes. Well, we'd start with every issues paper response that's come forward to the Royal Commission. Most of the issues papers the Royal Commission has put out is part of its policy development, and our formal responses have been compiled and designed and compiled by the Council, and we have obviously shown them to the supervisory group, not for approval but for endorsement. None of our positions in any of those position papers or responses has been knocked back. This particular recommendation for an oversight body was fully unanimously endorsed, not only by the supervisory group but by the two peak bodies at formal plenary meetings. Throughout the course of time of the 4 years, you may note that we as a council have put out sometimes, for want of a better term, model litigant guidelines or assistance in revisiting cases and so on. And leaders within the sector have used those as policy directives, again, not knocking back our position. So,
but you're not suggesting, Mr. Sullivan, that there weren't discussions with the supervisory group and others within the church leadership before you devised your position?
No, I'm certainly not suggesting that, because, you know, as good policy goes, where there's always a consultation around everything. We had draft position papers that went out not just to archbishops and religious leaders, but to broader people with competency in the area.
So the extent to which you weren't knocked back reflects what the final document looked like, doesn't reflect the discussions that may have gone on before that final document was put up.
Oh, that's true, although any significant position we wanted to adopt that was in our original drafts wasn't changed.
Thank you. Is there anything you wish to add to what Mr. Owen had to say?
No, nothing.
Archbishop, is there anything further you wish to say?
Perhaps just to say that the establishment of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council itself was, in some ways, not just a major achievement, but a monumental achievement. It was an attempt to shape a one-church approach, which, when you're dealing with the Catholic Church, is much harder than it sounds. It was, particularly in the early stages, very difficult to keep everyone in the tent. And the fact that we managed it, I think, again, is a very significant achievement and indeed historic in terms of the Catholic Church in Australia. Catholic Professional Standards Limited seems to me to build upon that achievement and to consolidate it, because, again, for all of these church bodies to come together and to coordinate and to collaborate in a new way, I think is genuinely historic, and for me at least is a glimmer of hope in a situation which at times can seem hopeless. But I think it does represent a slow and painful shift of the culture. And I think something has been set in train that I would certainly hope, and I actually think it is unstoppable now. But again, I come back to the point that there is no cause whatsoever for complacency. As has emerged in the discussion this morning, this proposal of Catholic Professional Standards Limited is an embryonic proposal. It's aspirational, and we can already see the need for some kind of modification. Similarly, the Ministry Register is embryonic. So these are initiatives which we have taken rather than simply wait for the Royal Commission's recommendations and report, which we do, but we felt that we had to act now. And what we have done may seem modest enough, but I think in fact in other terms it is very significant and even historic in terms of the Catholic Church in this country.
Thank you. Mr Owen, is there anything further you wish to say?
No, Ms Maness, thank you.
Thank you. Your Honour, I have nothing further.
Mr Needham.
Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you, Commissioners. Now, Mr Sullivan, you were asked some questions about the process by which the constitution of CPS was developed and referred to consultation. Could you tell the Commissioners how long that consultation has gone on and what the processes by which it was finalised were?
Yes, thank you. We started a process in February 2014 with the concept paper about what an oversight body could look like. And in those days, we were talking about an oversight body that was about the protection of children. And the way things work in the Catholic Church is you firstly need to get some buy-in by the leaders. And so that was a draft paper, and it went for some months. So by the middle of that year, 2014, we had demonstrated that a broader consultation was now required within the Catholic Church. To do that, we needed to put in a much more substantial effort in a green paper process, as governments would use it. A green paper process was developed on research, on background papers and the like. We designed all that and got that ready for a process that ran at the beginning of 2015, and that ran for the best part of 7 months, where we ran consultations across Australia in every capital city. And this was across individuals with expertise in the church in the areas of child protection, obviously in the areas of towards healing, in the management of allegations, but also people who understood administration in the church and the like. At the end of, and that was, consultation was run for us by an independent consultant who then wrote a report. The report was then given to our council. We also shared that report with the board of the National Committee for Professional Standards. That was really important so that they would at least be in the loop about what could end up being their future. And as you'll realise, that the National Committee for Professional Standards will now merge its functions into this company, you know, on a basis in which the company can cope with it. So that took us to the end of 2015, and by the end of 2015, the Bishops' Conference and the religious leaders had signed off on the model. And so for the first third of 2016, it was the drafting process, which was given to a firm, as you can see, by the Bishops' Conference and religious leaders to do the drafting. From that point on, the drafting of the Constitution occurred, and now you have the final product.
And the final product was launched at the end of last year?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that this is something that all of the myriad bodies making up the Catholic Church in Australia is prepared to do and to carry out?
That's our understanding, yes.
Now, you mentioned the rolling in of the National Committee for Professional Standards into the new body. Are you aware that 5.1E also provides for any state professional standards officers also to be encapsulated in the new body?
I am, yes.
And have there been any steps down that path as yet?
No, the idea in the first instance was for this oversight body to literally replace the National Committee for Professional Standards because there needed to be change. At one point, there was the option of whether we would just give extra powers to the National Committee for Professional Standards. But as the Archbishop has mentioned, there needs to be a culture change, and sometimes structure helps and function helps. Doesn't mean that culture, I'm very alive to what Father O'Hanlon said about culture and breakfast. But the point is, sometimes a new approach can bring with it changes of behaviour and that hopefully begins to start to address the underlying cultural issues. So this company will take on the functions of the National Committee for Professional Standards, hopefully in a timely way, but also in a manageable way. The state-based professional standards officers are separate to that, and they may well, for the time being, continue in their role, but making sure that they meet the standards that are required of them too, by way of timely service of individuals and the like.
Sorry, just on that point, will there be a formal agreement between the state-based authorities and the company?
It's possible. When we had the consultations, of course, the obvious point from some was, does this mean that the state-based professional standards are going to be abolished, officers be abolished, or are they going to become branches of the new company? Now, I think the way it works is that the board itself of the new company will want to consider those things, but the actual state professional standards officers are funded by bishops and religious leaders in that state. So the board would need to get into dialogue with the owners of those state-based officers if there's going to be any change in circumstance or role.
That doesn't answer the question. Do you envisage a formal agreement between the two bodies?
Well, I don't know what it would be, Commissioner, because it'll be up to the board, but if I was on the board, I'd be looking at some sort of agreement.
Mr. Sullivan and Archbishop, you may like to respond to this as well. You both mentioned the need for a change of culture.
Yes.
What are you talking about?
Well, Your Honour, if we talk about the matter at hand, which has been the whole scandal of child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, from where I sit and from what I've read and what I've heard over the time, it's ultimately been an abuse of power, not only by the perpetrators, but by those who have administered the complaints, the abuse itself. There has been a instinctive protectiveness within the institution of the church to look after itself, to almost be hypersensitive to the risk that are obvious and transparent enough for objective scrutiny. When decisions are made about personnel and who gets to go where, that we don't simply have to be bound by the canons, but that improved best practice management arrangements can be put in place so you have personnel committees and who sits on them. What level of competence is it of people on those committees? How wide, as Justice Owen said, are we prepared to make membership of those committees? And so on.
Archbishop, do you want to respond?
I agree with everything that Mr. Sullivan has said, but just to add my own angle on it. The first shift, it seems to me, and it is cultural, would be at the level of awareness, and that's a massive but essential educational task. An awareness of what child safeguarding really does entail. Secondly, then, the point of accountability. This applies to the church as a whole and to individuals within the church, like bishops. Because there has been a tendency, and I have said this earlier, for bishops and the church to have a sense of themselves as a law unto themselves. Now that has to change. In coming to the unanimous agreement to support this initiative of Catholic Professional Standards Limited, one of the great questions that exercised the Bishops' Conference concerned episcopal governance, which can take many forms in the church and has historically, but is regarded as a non-negotiable element of the church's life and structure. And some felt that this initiative was in some ways compromising or undermining the principle of episcopal governance. My own view, and the view of others, was that it's not in any way compromising or undermining the principle of episcopal governance. What it's trying to do is to help people like bishops and other church leaders to exercise the responsibility which they've patently failed to do. So that this new form of accountability does represent, in a church like mine, a genuine cultural shift to new forms of accountability. I would also think that it touches upon coordination or collaboration, new forms of coordination and collaboration within the church, and Catholic Professional Standards is one of those, but also new forms of coordination and collaboration between the church and the wider society, and this Royal Commission is a dramatic instance of that. So all kinds of new forms of collaboration and coordination, which again for us represent cultural change. The other thing is a consistency across the board, which is part of what I mean by coordination. Again, to try in Australia generally to have a consistency that reaches beyond the states is not easy. To have it within the Catholic Church, you have difficulty to the power of two. So to bring about a genuine consistency of approach will have to represent genuine cultural change. But also, and here I conclude, compassion, that to address all of these issues in their complexity and their intense practicality, their urgency, but to address them with the sense that the child or the vulnerable person must take priority, and that all of these issues must be seen through their eyes. That's what I mean by compassion. Now, you might say that's obvious in the case of a church. Well, yes and no. There have been dramatic failures, as has emerged in the course of this Royal Commission. So that kind of perspective on what we are talking about and dealing with does represent another form of cultural change. So they would be some of the elements of change that I mean when I speak about the need to shift the culture, and not just to shift the protocols and procedures. That has to happen. But if that doesn't lead to cultural change, the danger is we go round and round and round. And the appalling prospect is that we could end up where we started.
Yes.
Thank you, Commissioners. Now, moving on to Mr. Owen. Were you present in the hearing room when Teresa Devlin gave evidence?
I was.
And hearing her account of the Irish experience with the National Safeguarding Board, has that informed the answers that you've given today in any way?
It has. It has indeed. And it resonated with me because I have been around Catholic institutions for many years, and that those challenges about which she spoke are always there. So it resonated with me, and it has informed a lot of what I've said this morning, and I think it will continue to inform, because what I've noticed is that when I now go back and reread the Irish documents, I'm learning more from them than I did when I first read them.
And one of the issues, or one of the aspects of her evidence, is that they have been doing what CPS, or part of what CPS seeks to do for some considerable time.
That's right.
And in particular, she gave some evidence about the publication of reports in relation to church authorities. Do you recall that evidence that she gave?
I do.
And the fact that the reporting was not mandated, the reporting didn't happen by the board, but it was left to the church authorities.
Yes.
Now, that's not the model that CPS has.
Well, we have Clause 5,
Yes.
which mandates public reporting subject to what has been said about Clause 5.3, and nothing further to say about Clause 5.3. So we have a constitutional mandate Catholic Professional Standards will have a constitutional mandate to report, and no doubt that will also be taken up in the memoranda of agreements that are entered into.
Now, you heard Ms Devlin give evidence that while the choice whether to publish or not lay with the particular church authorities, to this point no one had so refused to publish. Do you recall that evidence?
I do.
And does that reflect to some extent your a differentiation between functional independence and structural independence?
Yes, it does. It does. That's an example of it. That's an example of functional independence in operation.
Now, the carve-outs in 5.3, I know you said you didn't want to say anything more about them, but in your view, does the Constitution give the company a power to make the reports either accurate or less confusing or less harmful to the church contacts?
That would certainly be part of the process. You would expect that if the Board of Catholic Professional Standards received an audit report, and bear in mind that's what it would be, received an audit report that it thought was inaccurate or could mislead, the natural thing would be to go back to the auditors and seek to have it clarified.
Rather than just refuse to publish it full stop?
Well, that's the way I would operate.
Yes, and that would be a power that the Constitution would give the board.
There's nothing in the Constitution that would prevent that, and it would be a normal operating procedure.
Now, you also referred to a differentiation between standards in relation to claims resolution and standards in relation to complaints handling. Would you like to expand upon that differentiation slightly?
What I had in mind when I said that was that I think that if a survivor wished to go directly to civil litigation or the redress scheme, there is a lesser role for the church authority to play in the handling of that allegation and complaint. So that you would be looking, I think, then more at the model litigant guidelines and compliance with the model litigant guidelines. But to the extent that the complaints handling procedure, by the choice of the survivor, is left within either wholly or partly the province of the church authority, then I think the standards would need to be more specific, more exact and more wide-ranging.
Now, moving to Archbishop Coleridge, you're one of the members' representatives within the company, and you've been appointed by the corporate body of the ACBC, is that correct?
Yes, I was not appointed, I was elected.
Elected, I'm sorry. Now, you would be in a position to know the attitude of the ACBC and presumably the CRA as to funding the CPS. Is it going to cost more than the NCPS has cost to date?
It will cost substantially more, and we have no option on that. I might say that in both bodies, the Bishops' Conference and the CRA, there was initially some apprehension about cost. in part because there was this sense that it's going to be a massive bureaucracy and how are we going to pay for this massive bureaucracy? But in fact, the intention at least, and the reassurance that was given both bodies, was that this will not be a massive and a massively expensive bureaucracy. It will in fact be very lean, but it will also over time be a costly undertaking. But the rhetorical question is, do we have a choice? And the answer given by both bodies was no. So despite the apprehension initially, there was a very strong, indeed unanimous commitment to fund CPS in any way that it needs to be funded. Because we don't want a repetition of what has happened in the past, where an ambivalence or lack of commitment has led to an under-resourcing, underfunding, and therefore has restricted or even crippled an operation. We certainly don't want that to happen with CPS.
Thank you. And finally, and this is a question for each of you, various witnesses during the last couple of weeks have expressed a hope that CPS will provide guidance in particular outcomes, and one in particular, which I don't think Ms Furness has mentioned, was the regulation of overseas press, and I use that only as an example. Have you each taken note of the various expressions by various witnesses and sought to learn from what has been expressed today?
Well, I certainly have. The marginal notes in my notebook are full of CPS question mark.
Thank you. Archbishop.
I have taken very careful note because this is something that I deal with literally from day to day. We do have very great challenges. They're not impossible to meet, but they are great challenges in this area, and I am very hopeful that CPS will help me and others who have to make decisions to handle the challenges or meet the challenges more effectively than we have.
Mr Sullivan?
Yes, I've taken note, and I think the whole point is that where CPS is at the moment is a work in progress, and a lot of what's been said in this session, but also in the last couple of weeks, I think needs to be taken on board.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask one question only, but it's relating to the publication of information. There's been general agreement by the panel that future information would be published in some form. In relation to the historic claims, the Royal Commission, based on the surveys that we jointly undertook, published the names of 28 institutions and the number of claims against those institutions. There's another more than 1,000 institutions in the church that have been disclosed in those surveys, parishes and schools. Would the starting point for transparency be the publication of the institutions by name and the number of claims that have been received in relation to those institutions?
Commissioner, in theory, yes. I think you may know that when we were working on the survey results with the Commission, we were concerned about the privacy of some victims. If, for example, we talk about, St Francis School, one victim, of course, some people may identify who that victim is simply by the fact that they knew there was one victim there, and we were worried about whether that would cause some stress in this process. I'm certainly not averse to naming the institutions. That was our only concern. So then we said, well, maybe it should be, institutions that had more than 5 people or something like that. Totally agree with the idea. We have to work out a way in which we don't, in some way, inadvertently, cause stress for some individuals. But as far as, this is certainly where our thinking is at, as far as future reporting, future data collection and so on, it must lead to enhancing the credibility of the church in its commitment to being open and not covering anything up. That would be the working principle.
Nothing further, Your Honour.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Again, thank you for your contribution. Archbishop, I think you come back to us again on Wednesday, Thursday, so I won't excuse you, but I'll excuse the other two. But thank you again. And we'll adjourn until
10 o'clock tomorrow morning, right?
10 in the morning.